All right, we're live. And then Jess, do you want to start recording, or do you want to, are we going to wait a couple of minutes just to see if people needed that extra time to get on?
Let's see, there's no one else in our waiting room right now, so I will start recording, and then Corinne, you can take it away. Thank you.
Well, I see the recording. Oh, yes. All right. So we are recording and we are live. Welcome to Fair Housing Friday. We are hosting this as part of Fair Housing Month. I'm Corinne here with CVOEO Fair Housing Project. Shifra and Jess are also here with CVOEO Fair Housing Project. And we're just really grateful to also have joining us today 3 panelists: Bora Yang from the Human Rights Commission, Vermont State Rep Brian Cina, and Dalib Bulle, who is one of our CVOEO Community Ambassadors. And I just want to, Jess, should I keep hanging on as people trickle in, or just keep going? All right, so we're gonna just take this time today to hear from our 3 panelists about housing equity here in Vermont. Housing equity and choice in Vermont housing is the title of this Fair Housing Friday. And we started the Fair Housing Fridays as part of Fair Housing Month last April. Of course, last April we had planned fair housing activities in person, and with the pandemic, it became important to switch to the online mode. But we found through doing these online that we actually reached a broader audience, and we're getting out some really important and time-sensitive information around housing, that the eviction moratorium and programs that were assisting people financially during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then, Jess, I think that's kind of all for the logistics. If you want to give us a little bit of context about Fair Housing Month.
Sure, thank you so much, Corinne. And so Fair Housing Month is, I'm sorry, there's just someone else to let into the group here. All right. So I'm Jess Hyman. I'm the director of the Fair Housing Project at CVOEO, which is one of CVOEO's statewide housing advocacy programs. And we work to protect and expand the fair housing rights of everyone who experiences discrimination and exclusion. So it's Fair Housing Month, and each April we recognize the anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. And this momentous occasion in history put essential protections into federal law, making it illegal to discriminate in the rental, sale, and financing of housing based on a number of different things, specifically race, color, national origin, religion, sex, family status, and also disability. And then Vermont has additional protections based on age, marital status, sexual orientation, and gender identity. The receipt of public assistance, so Section 8 vouchers, 3 Squares Vermont, Reach Up, etc. Excuse me, and also protections for people who've experienced abuse and sexual assault or stalking. And Vermont also has a wonderful, little bit wonky protected class or protection against the denial of development permitting based on the income of prospective residents. And this is essentially an anti-NIMBY protection. So all this means that it's not only unjust, but also against the law for people to be treated unfairly because of membership in any of these protected classes. And it's really important to note that discrimination really isn't always obvious. And often it can take many forms, and often here in Vermont, it's done with a handshake and a smile. So it can happen when a landlord tells you that an apartment isn't available when really it is, and they show it to the next person down the line. Or when the terms of your lease or financing are different than other people's, or when a real estate agent steers your family to a different neighborhood. And illegal discrimination can also happen in advertisements. So if you see single people only or professionals only, that's illegal housing discrimination. And it can also happen when you're settled into your home. And it's important to note that also harassment is covered under fair housing law, including sexual harassment. So you can learn a lot more at cvoeo.org/FHP. And if you're experiencing discrimination, please contact us or contact our friends at the Vermont Human Rights Commission or legal aid. And so the Fair Housing Act put these critical protections into law. And it also sought to repair and redress historical segregation in housing. But these inequities still exist. And the pandemic has only exacerbated these inequities and the housing crisis here in Vermont. So we have a long way to go to make sure that everyone has access to safe and stable and affordable homes. And conversations like the one we're about to have today are a step towards that. So we're delighted today to welcome our special guests to talk about housing equity and choice and how we can make positive and long-lasting changes here in Vermont. So first, we'd like to hear from Dalib Bulle. And Dalib is one of CVOEO's community ambassadors. And I will turn the screen over to you, Dalib.
Thanks, Jess, and I appreciate and to be here and share some of the experiences that some of the families face while looking for an apartment. That being said, my name is Dalib. I work as a community ambassador for CVOEO and have been involved in the community a lot. I've been recently hired at CVOEO, but prior to that, I was also working with the community in a variety of ways. Once as a secretary, another as a vice president, and currently as a homeschool liaison and also community ambassador. Coming back to the focus of this afternoon, being equity and choice in Vermont housing. On this topic, I've spoken with several families and they explained to me some of the barriers they have faced and they feel that it's still a problem. So I will be sharing that with you today. Somalis and Somali Bantus, immigrants, as many of you know, are new to the country compared to some other communities. And despite their recent arrival, most of them come not knowing the English language, which poses a lot of barriers in terms of finding a good job that would give them adequate income to sustain their large families. After speaking with several families, it became so much clear to me that not many families live in housing that are affordable. Besides affordability, there are also other barriers that follow, including racial tensions, discrimination, income, and lack of credit. Some of the barriers that the Somali and Somali Bantu communities face includes lack of enough space also. Overcrowding is a big issue. These communities have big families and finding enough space for their families is always difficult. For one, there aren't many bigger apartments here in Vermont, and also the cost is so expensive and just makes it impossible for them to afford. There are also low rates of home ownership because of lack of good credit history, even though some families are moving towards home ownership now with the help of CVOEO. I have to mention that some of the families were very thankful to CVOEO for their work in helping families build their credit history by offering them classes and helping them with the process of securing a credit card, which ultimately gives them an opportunity to build their credit. So this kind of help is what has given many families an opportunity to succeed. As one family puts it out, it opened new doors of opportunities for us. It is something that the families really appreciate so much. One of the families that I also interviewed was also looking for an apartment to rent a while back in Winooski, and they found one that was big enough for their family. They met with the landlord, and there was an application to be filled out, of course. Once the application was all finished, the landlord looked at the application and said he wouldn't rent them the apartment because they will make the place all dirty, considering the number of kids that were put on the application. Some families feel like they are forced to lie about the size of their families in order to be able to rent a place. Also, when new families are resettled in the country, they're supposed to find a job right away and start paying their bills, including rent. Rent is very expensive, as you may already know, and when refugees are resettled, they find jobs, but the jobs they find are often entry-level jobs. And honestly, these kinds of jobs do not give you an adequate income to pay your rent and other basic necessities that you need. There is a single parent family that has been resettled in this community very recently from a refugee camp. And as usual, the parent has to search for work right away to start paying for her bills. She still couldn't afford a place because what mom makes is way too low to cover rent and other needs. Since it was impossible to keep up with the rent, the family ended up being homeless. When people are facing such a crisis, they apply to the housing authorities to get affordable housing or get some help with the rent. Once they apply, they have to wait for what is called a voucher. And waiting for a voucher after applying for one often takes a very long time. And when one will become available, it's usually unknown. You have to wait several years till one is available. A voucher can become available also at any time of the year after several years of waiting though. Getting rid of the family's preference on when to move and also to coordinate with family obligations or even work schedules. Vouchers can become available at an inconvenient time also during winter or the school year when moving can be very difficult. Also, another big problem is finding housing within the time limit given, which is 90 days, according to some families, although some say it can be extended for a little bit. The pressure to find housing within the given time, in addition to financial troubles and poor timing, can pressure a family to choose a lower quality house or even a location that's not even as safe. Subsidized housing is designed to help low-income families afford decent, safe homes and have the opportunity to move out of low-income neighborhoods, according to the understanding of some of the families. When given a voucher, you should be able to move where you can find an affordable home, but this is not how some of the families feel. They feel that landlords are controlling them because they can only move where landlords accept them. Even though landlords must accept these vouchers, still there are cases where landlords have refused them. The program does not provide assistance with security deposits and moving costs, leaving these costs to fall on the shoulders of the families. Credit checks present yet another problem. If you don't have good credits, everyone knows that it's difficult to do anything, including renting an apartment, of course. Since many families have poor credit histories, they experience a lot of rejection. Landlords that have poor housing units are more willing to accommodate families that have subsidized housing vouchers if they have enough money for deposits than landlords that have nicer apartment units. The housing program requires landlords who accept a voucher to have their housing inspected and approved by the housing authority, according to one family. Scheduling these inspections can take time and the landlord loses income while the house is off the market. And when things like this happen, landlords increase the rent, which will be more than what the housing authority would cover. And even if you promise to pay the difference, the housing authority will not allow you to, according to another family, and adds that your chances of renting that apartment is slim. Landlords incur additional costs also if improvements are required for the house. Again, the housing program does not cover these costs. And this is another reason why landlords don't like to rent to families that have vouchers, because they feel like they're forced to fix the house. Another family I also interviewed had a story like it that I just explained happened to them. The difference between what the housing allows and what the landlord wanted was $50 actually, if I recall correctly. And even though the family was determined to pay the difference, still the housing would not allow. So as a result of that, the families were not allowed to rent that apartment also. So these are some problems that families explained when searching for a place to rent that they have shared. That is all actually I wanted to share.
Thanks so much, Dalib, for going to those specifics. And like I said in the beginning, I think it's really important for people to hear, because it's not just finding housing that's hard, as you said. It's all of the barriers in between with the vouchers. We appreciate that perspective. Now, at this time, we're going to pass the mic, so to speak, to Representative Brian Cina. If you are ready to jump in.
I was born ready. So just need to use humor to get through the endless staring at a computer life that, although I am blessed that I get to see some people in person through my regular job, so that's nice. But it is nice to be here with you all today virtually, and to speak about this issue of housing. And as I listened to the previous speaker, Dalib, as I listened to you speak, I was hearing in the story, or in the stories, that a reflection of the reality of how housing is treated by the society in which we live. And we live in a society which treats housing as a commodity. We don't treat housing as a human right. And I was asked to come here today to talk about a bill. But before I get into the details of that bill, I think it's important to just take a moment to acknowledge what is the social construction of housing in this society? Like because we do treat housing as a commodity. And in that context, tenants are a source of income for landlords to sort of extract from. And so whether those tenants are paying for that through money that they earn, whether the state's paying for that through vouchers, in the end, that housing is treated as a commodity that can be exploited by some to accumulate wealth, without addressing the disparity of wealth that exists in our society. And the bill that I was asked to come talk today about, the purpose of this bill is to address that wealth disparity through housing, through land. But we acknowledge in the bill that we're playing the game when we do that, and we're not talking about the underlying problem, which is the commodification of housing and the treatment of land as something that we could even own. That land, that this belief that land is something that humanity owns, which is in contradiction to the beliefs of many cultures from around the earth throughout history, who believe that humans belonged to the earth. The earth didn't belong to the humans. And so I think it's important to address that up front, because that dynamic underpins a lot of the conflict we experience. And a lot of the times we're living in this world, and we know something's wrong with what's going on around us, but in order to survive, we have to keep moving so fast that we don't get the time to question it. And when we take a moment to stop and think about it, it makes sense why it feels so wrong that people feel like they have to lie to get housing because a landlord might not give it to them, and that people feel like they have to play this game constantly just to have a place to live, and that people feel like it's not fair that they can walk certain places but not other places, and it's weird that resources that are here you can access but here you can't because someone else has this or owns this. And then when you look at why, it really doesn't make sense. Why does this group get to have that but the other group doesn't get to have it? And it all goes back to the history of this country, which is rooted in colonization. And so when we look at the bill, I'll pivot to the bill now because I know that's what people wanted me to talk about, but I just thought it was important to acknowledge that up front, and how the bill fits in this context, that the bill is a solution from within the system. It doesn't address the underlying problem. And we say that in the bill. So I don't know, would it be helpful to have like visuals to go along with my talking, or is it better if I just talk? I'm asking the facilitators.
Yeah, I mean, Jess, I don't know if you can give Brian, yes, you can pull up visuals if that.
Okay, I promise I won't accidentally traumatize you by showing you my to-do list or my schedule. I'll only show you the presentation. I just want to make sure I get it ready before I say that and then make a false promise. All right, so I found it somewhere on the web. So I'll just use it. May not be the well, there might be a better way to show this. Hold on. Oh, here we go. I'll just download it for the moment and open it up. Okay. So sorry, that didn't work. It'll just give me a second. I had something ready and then now I can't find it, but I'm gonna pull up like a little presentation of the bill. Here we go. All right. Because it just might help to walk through it with visuals for some people. And for those who can't see, I will still speak so that you can still follow along. All right, there. So you should, for those who can see, you will now see, this is a presentation that I gave to the committee when introducing the bill. So it's an act relating to promoting racial and social equity in land access and property ownership. And here's the legislative intent, which I am going to read. Equal opportunity is a fundamental principle of American democracy. However, structural racism, defined as the laws, policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other societal norms that work together to deny equal opportunity, structural racism has resulted in wealth disparities among Vermonters. Wealth disparities are a function of not only access to income, but also the ability to have access to the land and to property ownership. The foundation of our current economic system was built on land that was taken from Abenaki and other indigenous persons. And the structures of our economic system were constructed with the labor of enslaved persons. The legacy of settler colonialism and chattel slavery has been systemic racism and discrimination, embedded into many aspects of our modern way of life on this land. The relationship between all persons and the land has been used to oppress persons over the past several centuries. The laws and policies of our state and nation severed indigenous persons from their land while denying them, Black persons and other persons of color, from having the opportunity to access and to own land. In order to offer repair for the systemic discrimination faced by many persons throughout the state over the past 4 centuries, the state of Vermont must engage in a just transition to an economic system that systemically undoes racism instead of reinforcing it. Efforts to remedy wealth disparity in the United States have traditionally looked to the free market economy for solutions to the very problem that it has created. However, there has been increased recognition that improving access to land and property ownership will require broader approaches. In order to rectify this history of inequity, we must create opportunities for permanent land access in every town in Vermont through collective and individual land ownership options, using new systems that empower and center Vermonters who have historically suffered from discrimination. And so I'll just pause for a second and take the screen share off. That the bill was created by a group of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, led by women and LGBTQ people in particular, who came together as a coalition called Seeding Power Vermont. And our purpose is to, what originally was around this land access bill, although now it's expanding, and our purpose is to look at ways to create solutions to problems that consider the power dynamics behind the problems, so that in the solution, we're not just doing something that feels good for the people who already have power, but solutions that actually transform the power dynamic and address the underlying issue. And so we acknowledge with this bill that until there is a process of truth and reconciliation, and I think, hold on, I think I don't know if it was in the legislative intent if we say those words, but until we have a process of truth and reconciliation for slavery and for colonization, we really aren't getting to the root problem. In the meantime, though, the people who have faced discrimination still need a remedy, and we still need to be working from within the existing systems to address the harm. And so what this bill does particularly, it has a findings section, which is very, I'll go back to the thing, and then I'm going to just talk another minute because I don't know how much time we have and I want to leave time for others and for questions. But so I'm not going to go through the findings in detail, because the other day we had a presentation of the findings in committee by the creators of the bill, and it was an hour. well, it was 30 minutes of them talking and 30 minutes of questions, but it takes a long time to go through the findings. They're very detailed, but I will show you these sources. So now I have to try to figure out how to do that again. Here we go. So here's just a list of the findings. And so you can see here a variety of resources. For those who can't see it, I'm sorry, I'm not going to read all the citations to you, but I'm showing people a list of like 30 citations right now. So these are the findings, and basically with the findings, what we found is that there's many examples from history over the last 200 to 400 years of policies and laws and actions of the state and federal government to create systems that discriminated against people, whether it be the Dawes Act, which took land that had been taken from indigenous people and then redistributed it back to indigenous people in small parcels, or whether it be the practice of redlining, which determined that, which divided up towns and cities in ways that discriminated against Black people and other people of color. We can look at many different policies that existed, that whether they happened in Vermont or other places, that the economy of this country has many examples of ways that policy was used to deny access to land in ways that led to wealth disparity. And so in order to address that, we need to look at increasing access to land and property ownership as a way to address wealth disparity. And so you can see here, the purpose of the bill is to invest in individual and collective land access and property ownership as a way to move towards greater racial and social equity in wealth distribution. And this act does it by creating a Vermont Land Access and Opportunity Fund in the state treasury, which would consist of money appropriated by the General Assembly and any other funds provided by public or private sources. And this would be administered by the Vermont Land Access and Opportunity Board, which would be an independent board. And I'm not going to read every member of the board, but it's a board with appointees from a variety of organizations representing Black, Indigenous, and other people of color and LGBTQ people. And I will say that in testimony this week, there were some questions about why people with disabilities aren't on this group. And so I would say that at this point, if the committee were to work on this bill, they should look at making sure that all people who've experienced some kind of discrimination have membership on this group in some way, acknowledging that there are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who have experienced every kind of discrimination that here, but because we don't explicitly say that those voices of color should be on this group, I heard the criticism of the committee. And so I think they could look at this and find ways to make sure that we are making sure that all groups who've experienced some kind of discrimination are represented in this board, so that when they're making their decisions, they're thinking about everyone who's faced discrimination. The powers and duties, it allows them to give money out for primary residences, farms, for land access and stewardship programs, financial education programs. That it gives the board the ability to hire advisors to help them with this work, to fund anti-racist mutual aid networks, to groups that propose to share land, create commons and have collective ownership, to give funds to the Everytown Project, to try to hold land in trust in every municipality in Vermont, to work with the Vermont Housing and Finance Agency, to explore ways to apply grants to mortgage subsidies and explore ways to overcome the barriers to obtaining a mortgage, including debt to income ratios, redlining, and the impact of algorithmic systems of decision-making, and to work with the Vermont Department of Taxes to look at tax breaks and to the properties attached to the grants. I'm not going to read the rest of the presentation because it's some of the details around it's simple enough to just say that this group would have the authority to adopt the rules concerning eligibility criteria, so they can make sure that the way that they're giving out these funds complies with state and federal laws around discrimination. And that we would ask that they give the grants out in a way that achieve a balanced, healthy mix of private and collective ownership. So that's what the bill does. And ultimately, the last thing I'll say about it is that if we're going to treat housing as a commodity, like until we move away from that, if we're going to treat housing as a commodity, we need to do better to make sure that more people can own their housing, and that this bill comes from the angle of the impact of Black, Indigenous, and
Down
other
here
people of.
in the hall, listen to the rest of this talk on fair housing.
Hey, somebody's unmuted and
different
is
about it.
interrupting us. Can you mute yourself? Actually, I could probably do that as a host. So, can you mute yourself, Tyler? Thanks. Thank you. So the last thing I was going to say is that the bill comes at it from the perspective of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, but we acknowledge that there's many people, all kinds of people have been impacted by this. And so my hope is that this is one of many examples of ways that the state could find, could provide opportunities for more people to own. And that could be cooperative ownership. It doesn't have to be the traditional model of like, or collective ownership, but more opportunities to own, because in the end, we've been going in the wrong direction, and land has been being accumulated by fewer people over time. It's in the hands of fewer people who have more control, and we need to find ways to make sure that more people have access to wealth and ultimately have more power over their lives. So thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Representative Cina. I just want to say that we do appreciate all of the extra context leading into the bill, and no one was ever under the illusion that we could tell you what to say. We and just really appreciate you kind of grounding the conversation in that reality check. And I will pass the mic over to Bor, the director of the Human Rights Commission, but quickly I just want to say that I know that there are already questions kind of budding from the audience. We will have a Q&A at the end, and certainly, yes, we want to be thinking about solutions, and also that this conversation is really especially important right now as we are facing a continued change in Vermont landscape, but that's certainly heightened by some of the newer folks that are coming into Vermont because of the COVID-19 crisis, and more to come. Anyways, Bor, take it away.
Thank you. I come to these things and I always take away so much more than what I provide. And I really have so far just really appreciated being here and hearing both Representative Cina and Dalib share some of those stories. So again, my name is Bor, and I'm the Executive Director and Legal Counsel for the Vermont Human Rights Commission, which has the mission of promoting full civil and human rights in Vermont. And we enforce the anti-discrimination laws of this state in 3 areas: housing, places of public accommodations, and state government employment. And just to clarify, places of public accommodations is schools, prisons, roads, government entities, businesses. If it provides services and benefits to the public, it falls within that definition. I want to respond to the stories of having to trick housing providers in order to get housing, because that resonates with me, because I've heard many stories like that. I've heard stories of people lying about being a law student or a student just to get housing. I've heard stories of people lying about their family size and family makeup as well, because we live in a culture in which it's unusual for people to live with extended family or have large families. And so then it seems odd to specifically white dominant culture that people would live with their in-laws or their grandparents or great grandchildren or nieces and nephews would even live together. And I'm married to a white man with a white name. And so when I was looking for housing, I used his name, even though I was really the one looking as well, because the name Boryang sounds very foreign, and I knew that. And so this is real. And there is a lot of trickery going on. I also want to respond to what Representative Cina said about housing as a commodity versus a basic human right. And I was reminded of a training that I did for 10-year-old kids on what is human rights. Okay. And they were so wonderful. I was talking to them and we were going over like, what are some basic things that everybody deserves no matter what? And of course they came up with like, every kid should have the right to go to school. Every kid should have the right to not be bullied in school. Every kid should have housing. Every kid should have healthcare. And I said, did you know that there are housing providers in Vermont that do not want kids to live in their houses? Did you know that? And those kids were like, what? And they had such a deep and wonderful and loving discussion about human rights. And we somehow graduated from those ideas as adults. We have like left what little children understand to be basic human rights to a concept now that you can only buy into those human rights. And it was, I think we obviously need to return to that and recognize that. Housing, while we do state government employment discrimination and public accommodations, I would say that at the Human Rights Commission, housing discrimination enforcement is the most important work that we do. And that's because housing is connected to all of other rights. Housing is connected to schools. It is connected to school choice. Housing is connected to the jobs that we can take, whether we can balance work with our family obligations. Housing is connected to clinics and hospitals, especially if we have chronic health conditions. Housing is connected to community support groups. Housing is connected to public transportation if you don't have a vehicle or if you're sharing vehicles. Housing is connected to our safety and our overall general health. Having land means the right to privacy, the right to farm, the right to move around in nature and not be bothered. And so it is incredibly important. So when you remove someone's right and choice to housing, you actually remove all of those rights, not just housing itself. When you deny someone housing, you are denying them employment opportunities in schools and hospitals and healthcare and all of those things as well. And so that's why I think it's incredibly important. Housing discrimination is prevalent in Vermont, very prevalent. And part of that is because there's a lack of affordable housing in Vermont. Even though we have laws that prohibit retaliation, it is still a very real risk that reporting one's landlord or housing provider for discrimination will risk that housing. We're likely, as people of color, to put up with unfavorable and unfair terms and conditions. We know we're being treated differently, but we're not willing to fight that because it risks the housing and all of those other rights that is connected to the housing that I mentioned earlier. So housing choice is critical to mitigating housing discrimination. It's kind of like, and I talk about this a lot because I came from a large metropolitan city and I consider myself a foodie. It's like restaurants and good restaurants. In a highly competitive environment, only good restaurants survive because there's choice. Right? In Vermont, we don't have a lot of great restaurants. I'm sorry I sound elitist to say that, but it's true. You're not going to put up with sexual harassment by a landlord or a housing provider if you know that you have the same housing choice 2 blocks down that doesn't compromise schools or public transportation or your jobs. So it is really, really significant. Also in Vermont, there are many housing providers who are not in the ordinary business of renting. They have no knowledge, no understanding of fair housing laws, such as service animals and assistance animals and reasonable accommodations modifications. They do discriminate against people with children. They do discriminate against Section 8 all of the time, very openly, very explicitly, even though that's against the law. They might ask, they have no policies, they have no procedures that they follow. And if they do, they don't apply them consistently. So they have a gut feeling that this person isn't truly employed, so they ask for tax returns. But someone else, they don't have that gut feeling and they use their implicit bias to go, well, I just need to know that you're employed. And then they become comfortable with that. And then they may or may not do a credit check. Likewise, housing is prevalent in Vermont because people rent through word of mouth. People sell, by the way, also through word of mouth. They never advertise, and instead they use their friends to find tenants. We know that homeowners tend to skew white and higher income. And so, and it's sad, it's 2021, but it's sad and it's true that our groups of friends still tend to share similar characteristics as we do. And so if homeowners are white and higher income, those are their groups of friends. Those are the people they're using to rent to and to sell to. It's also really hard for entities like Vermont Legal Aid to do testing, which is when they send actors out to test to see if housing discrimination is present, because the housing only remains on the market for a very short period of time. If you have a housing provider that doesn't want to rent to Black people, they have 9 white people who are equally qualified. You're never gonna hear them use discriminatory language. And it's very possible that some of those other 9 might even have like a higher income, and they rely on those what they consider neutral factors for the reason why they picked other prospective tenants. Dalib mentioned this, but Section A vouchers have long waiting lists, and once you get it, there's a very short period of time to use it or you lose it. If you are interested in using that Section A voucher within a certain school district or within a certain town, good luck finding housing in that town. So you are again compromising all of those other choices that you have. And this is important because we're constantly balancing the housing that we want and the community that we want with the job that we want and the transportation that we want and the other economic opportunities that we want as well. And that's really unfair. These are all sort of the factors that we see a lot that create a housing market in which housing discrimination is prevalent, difficult to detect, and difficult to mitigate. And what we keep doing instead is like creating more protected categories, or we do these other things other than really addressing the basic problems, which is creating more affordable housing, creating more economic opportunities for everybody, and not just economic opportunities at the lowest level, but leadership opportunities also for people of color. And we need to change the way credit is determined. Credit, and I appreciate what you said, Dalib, about how people are getting credit cards to change their credit. Really? Credit cards? I mean, that's really sad. That credit in America is determined by the things that tend to skew in favor, again, white people and people with higher socioeconomic levels, right? We don't use things like renting a vehicle or rental or utilities or storage rental. We don't use those things to determine credit. Credit is credit card and mortgages and these large loans, which is, again, very unfortunate. So I just wanted to share that I know how difficult it is, and also that nevertheless, we do see some very successful cases at the Human Rights Commission. And I would encourage you that if you see housing discrimination, that you call us and contact us and let us vet that. We do have to be pretty steadfast in this fight to mitigate housing discrimination and simultaneously address all of those barriers and those issues around housing and affordable housing in Vermont. So thank you for this time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks, For. I do know that there was a question earlier in the chat that I'm going to locate in a minute, but I think that as we close out, you know, we have like 15 minutes roughly to close out this conversation. And I think what a lot of us want to hear is what we can do to start advocating for solutions. And so I heard you, Boris, say more affordable housing. And I wonder, what does that look like? What do we, our community, do to advocate for more affordable housing? And like, you know, we think of Burlington, there is actually inclusionary zoning. Is that enough? I mean, Dalib is saying that the community he's working with says that they don't feel like they have a choice in housing. So that's just the question I'm throwing out to the panelists for now as I dig through our chat to find the earlier question. And our audience on the line, I do encourage you to ruminate your own questions and stick it in the chat. Does anyone
Thank
wanna-
you.
I
Thank you,
can ask.
Corinne. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna actually ask my question with my voice. I'd let you see my face, but I'm like in my kitchen making lunch at the same time. Oh well, I'll do it anyways. So just kind of wondering, and Brian kind of answered it. So I guess I maybe should move on to a different question. The initial one was just kind of what real estate agents can do to help advocate. In my experience, National Association of Realtors doesn't really represent what I think. A lot of it is, I mean, along party lines on both ends. But I would imagine that Vermont Association of Realtors isn't necessarily like super excited getting on board right now. So curious what realtors can do. And on a slightly different note, in my conversations with developers, what they blame for not being able to build affordable housing is Act 250. And I'm curious, any of your viewpoints on that. Their argument is basically we can't build affordable houses because Act 250 makes it too expensive to go through that process. Yeah, curious any of your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Martha. Who wants to start with that? There's a couple questions there. I do think it's worth, I know, Brian, you answered Martha's question in the chat, but I think it's worth responding in real time for the recording as well.
Okay, well, I'll start with that. So in the chat, Martha had asked, what could realtors do to help, or what could a realtor do to help? And I was saying that one realtor organizing other realtors to advocate for the passage of the bill would be helpful, and providing testimony, like sending official written testimony to the committee and asking them to put it on the record, speaking in support of the bill would help, and asking to come in and testify would help. You may not get time, but the more that people do that, the greater the interest it shows, and you can always submit written testimony. In fact, I question why we can't create a way for people to provide video testimony, even if you don't come in this day and age, but that doesn't exist yet. But you could send a video to the committee and say, I know you don't have time for me to come in, but watch my 1-minute video I'm sending you about this issue. So I think that organizing realtors in support of the bill would be powerful, because I find that the voice of realtors has weight with legislators. It shouldn't be a surprise that in a capitalist society that the voice of business has extra weight. And so when any kind of field of business organizes itself and pushes on an issue, that has a huge impact. So we would appreciate it if realtors who supported us spoke out. We saw in Burlington that some realtors organized against just cause eviction and spent lots of money lobbying against that, and it didn't work, but like that had a huge impact on the discussion. So I think if there was organizing on this bill, it would have, whether or not the bill passes remains to be seen, but it would have a huge impact on the discussion. So I appreciate the question. And then the next one was about Act 250. And now that I answered that, I don't exactly remember the question, but there's a lot of issues with Act 250. It's like a really complicated situation. But ultimately, when we talk about inclusionary zoning and we talk about like affordable housing, I find that the way that we're constructing those terms is problematic. Like, for example, I'll just give one example and then I'll stop and let others jump in. Is it like in Burlington, like a certain percentage, I think it's 15%, I could be wrong, of units in a development have to be affordable. And like, but that number is actually not affordable for many people. So it's like what's considered affordable is actually expensive for most people. And so it's like 15% are mildly expensive, and then like 85% are astronomically expensive. So like that's one of the many examples of the way that we've structured policy to favor development that is not built for the majority of people to own. So I'll stop there because I know others have insightful things to add. That was my little tidbit.
I don't know if I have anything insightful to add, but I will say that I'm just going to very generically answer the question because you're right. All of our leaders have a real concern about market and the marketplace and letting the marketplace control what happens. And there is and this is something I've seen for a really long time, is that we have this idea that the way that we distribute wealth has to be top down. The money has to be given to developers. There has to be incentives for developers. We have to give money to the banks. We have to give money to the other lending institutions, and let them determine how to distribute that wealth, because we don't trust people. Our government does not trust the people with money. Instead, what we really should do is, if we want that marketplace to be as it is, you actually should just give that money to people, and they will change the marketplace. It's sort of like the conversations around forgiveness of student loans. If you forgave student loans, what do you think people will do with their extra income? They will buy houses, they will buy cars, they will buy land, they will pay off other loans, they will do everything, they will put that money right back into the marketplace. But instead, we really debate about whether or not we should give that money directly to people. When we had the foreclosure crisis, we were bailing billions of dollars, bailing out banks, instead of actually handing that money to people to do what? Pay off the banks. And then people could actually be mortgage free. But we have an institution that does not trust the people. And the reason for that is because we put the most privileged and elite in those positions of power. And we need to question that. Instead of continuing to do that, we need to question whether those are the right people to govern us. And so that's a very generic answer to your question. I also want to mention that, because I've been a renter since I moved to Vermont, that I've been looking for housing recently, and because of COVID and so many people moving to Vermont, that it has been incredibly impossible to find to even buy a house. And that's because I cannot beat cash offers, no contingencies. I cannot beat New York City money or Boston money. And that is the marketplace that is happening right now in terms of even home and land ownership. And so what can our government do with that when people don't or can't afford to beat that kind of marketplace? They can offer some kind of incentives. Real estate agents are probably in the best position to figure out how to resolve that. And they could come up with solutions for the government to address how Vermonters can buy homes in that kind of marketplace too. Instead of just saying, that's the market and we can't do anything about it. So.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Brian. And I do want to just add to Representative Cina mentioned that the inclusionary zoning in Burlington is not necessarily affordable. What does affordable mean? But to kind of add to that, it's actually not necessarily affordable to people with Section 8 vouchers. So Dalib was talking about in the beginning how folks with Section 8 often can't find housing that is within the price range, and our inclusionary zoning laws here in Burlington continues that problem by not making it so that affordable is affordable for people with Section 8. And Dalib, since we stuck you at the beginning, it's been a while since we've heard from you. I just wanted to give you the opportunity to either chime in to add what you think that we can do as a community to better support the folks in your community, or just offer any kind of thoughts, you know.
Well, I mean, my ideas, I think what I was thinking is that, you know, it is actually very tough to be three things in this country today, and that is to be Black, and also to belong to the faith of Islam, or to be a refugee or immigrant. And unfortunately, the Somali and the Somali Bantus fall in all categories. So sometimes, you know, I feel like there is the stigma that Black people are not hard workers, and that a landlord just makes a decision based on your physical appearance. I think more education needed. These landowners or landlords need to understand that you know, we are equally the same, and that, you know, we are also hard workers, and that if people are given the opportunity, they succeed.
Thanks, Dalib.
Mhm.
And I did see earlier in this chat, and trying to like stay on it, so I apologize if I missed any questions, but Tyler offered, one of the challenges from a real estate perspective for me is that we're not allowed to choose who we work with. So even if we wanted to help BIPOC families invest in housing, we cannot because of fair housing laws. I guess I wonder, from my perspective, I'm not a lawyer, so or maybe you can respond to this, but how does that work with affirmatively furthering fair housing? Can real estate agents not prioritize folks that fall into the protected categories as a affirmative action to fair housing law?
My understanding is that we can't. So the solution I've been thinking of is, I can show my face again. The solution I've been thinking of as a workaround, because as far as I know, there's no, like, I'm not allowed to like offer, what I'd like to do is be able to offer part of my commission as, you know, a closing cost credit or something to BIPOC folks. And I don't think I'm allowed to do that. So I've been thinking of a workaround of like sending money to a grant with a nonprofit. But yeah, that's like kind of absurd to have to do that much. That's what my like research and looking into that has shown. But that's a question I've kind of been asking. And if anyone else has different information, I'd be all ears.
I think we need to revisit affirmative action because we have some really bad case law that has suggested that you can never favor BIPOC people. And because that would be racism against white people. And what those decisions did was then continue to perpetuate discrimination against BIPOC people. And so now whenever we're moving or thinking around policies, we have to take into consideration some of those court decisions around that, which is really hard and difficult. But no law is set in stone, not even the Constitution of the state of the United States. And so it's always up to the people to determine that, like, if you have a group of people and you think that that law is prohibiting you from furthering equality and justice, you have the ability to lobby to change that law. And something that we tend to do is say, these are the constraints and now I'm stuck and I have to work under that, rather than questioning how can I empower myself and other people like me to change those constraints. And I can just say as a lawyer that lawyers do that all the time. Lawyers go, this is the law, this is the law, this is the law. And instead of going, what can I do as a lawyer to change the law? When can I challenge that law? And so I think as real estate agents, you are an incredibly powerful group of people that have the ability to change the laws and the policies that pertain to you. In fact, you are probably the only people that can really truly do that. So.
Corinne, can I say something about it quickly?
Please do.
Okay, so I know that the law says that we can't discriminate against people, but does the law say that you cannot work harder to reach certain people? And when I went to Dartmouth College, when I open up the Dartmouth Alumni Magazine, what's the first thing that I see? It's multi-million-dollar properties being advertised by real estate agents, so they're obviously like making an extra effort to reach out to the wealthiest white people, who might want to buy property around the Hanover, New Hampshire area. So likewise, is it against the law for real estate agents to work harder to reach BIPOC? I don't know. My understanding is it's denying someone, not working harder for someone. So I think that there's ways that the real estate community could come together and figure out and meet with BIPOC and learn what the barriers are and try to work a little harder to help people around them. And some of those barriers are going to be things that we do need to change the law and policy on, which is why we introduced the BIPOC-led Land Access and Opportunity Act. One other thing I want to throw out there before we end is that Vermont is on the verge of a massive opportunity, and people need to be aware of it immediately. That the governor has announced that he wants us to invest in a massive housing plan. The COVID money that's coming in is adding money to our economy, and it has allowed us to provide housing and hotels for people who are houseless through the pandemic. But there's thousands of people who need housing, and housing that's not there for them right now. So the state's going to have to invest in some way in thousands of units of housing over the next few years. How we do that hasn't been determined yet, but we have a huge opportunity to change the game. Like, for example, imagine if we built hundreds of units of housing that were cooperatives. And imagine if it was, and maybe this is illegal, and we could change the law, maybe not. But imagine if a person who has Section 8, that if they lived in the cooperative, that they were building equity. That there was a way, if that was possible, so that after a few years of a family living in a cooperative, they had equity. They could go out and buy another home, and when they move out of that cooperative and they sell that share, there's some equity. I don't know enough about the barriers, but this is just a visionary thing. Like, we could invest the money in new ways, and we can invest in some of the existing ways that work. But we have an opportunity here to do things a little differently, and if we did it right, we could help lift people out of poverty. By giving them access to a way to accumulate wealth that they otherwise wouldn't have. And so some of us in the legislature are going to be pushing around this issue. There's a coalition of us between the Healthcare, Human Services, and House General Committee of legislators talking about this, because we do feel like there's got to be a way that we can use that money to get more out of it. And if we just give money to developers to help them build more housing that's for profit, we're giving the money of the people to someone to provide a service that in the long term is going to make them money, while keeping more people stuck in that cycle of having wealth extracted from them and concentrated in the hands of others. And if we can invest that money in housing that allowed people to build equity and wealth, we could work towards the redistribution of wealth, and that would have a massive impact on future generations if we could be lifting families out of poverty as we build ourselves a recovery out of this pandemic. So I'll just throw that out there, because people should be paying attention, and as these ideas come forward, we're going to need community support, and we're going to need people to organize to push through these ideas, because the other side, the people who already have power and wealth, are going to be using every piece of power they have to get as much as they can. And they are already doing that with pandemic relief money. So, but the majority of people, we outnumber them. So if we organize ourselves and we apply the pressure, we can gain, we can create some changes that would provide gains for the many instead of the few. So I just want to throw that out there. I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's actually a really excellent segue. I am aware that we went a little bit over time, but I feel like this was an important conversation. But next Friday, we will be continuing our Fair Housing Friday discussion to look at the changing housing landscape in Vermont. And I know that one of the solutions that we'll be thinking about a little bit more deeply is, or one of the solutions we'll be looking into is the suburb of Chicago and Evanston in Illinois have instituted a reparations bill to start to address the effects of redlining in their community. It's not without criticism, but it is a really interesting model to look at. And I know that our panelists will be thinking a little bit more about that. So I do encourage everyone that is really looking at a way to kind of plug in and look at solutions to come back and join us next Friday for our next Fair Housing Friday, the changing housing landscape here in Vermont. And then just before we close out too, I want to say that last week we heard from a student in South Burlington, Manel, who talked about her experience of noticing in her community in South Burlington. She did an internship with a realtor and started noticing, hey, I'm not seeing people who look like me owning homes in my community. And she did a really great investigation into housing discrimination in South Burlington. I just can't recommend enough taking a look at that. Lastly, I did see our friend Devin Ayers at Vermont Legal Aid chime in to say it is possible this cooperative housing idea. She herself is a resident at cooperative housing, and so maybe Devin, you'll be joining us next week as well to kind of talk more about cooperative housing. And before we close out, I just want to give the opportunity to our panelists. If there's any last words that you wanted to say that we didn't get to, please feel free to chime in now. You're good? All right.
Just
All
thank
right.
you.
Well, I can't say enough. We're just so grateful you three were able to join us for this conversation. I know we all felt at the Fair Housing Project that this was a really powerful and much needed space to start talking about this. Not start, but continue talking about this. So thank you. All right, and we'll be sharing this on our social media. Thank you everyone who joined us, and stay tuned for more.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye everyone. Thank you. All right, and then there is two. Okay, Shifra, any thoughts, last words?
Nothing. Thank you so much. Have a good one.
All right.